Hey guys, welcome back. In the first lesson of the AI course, we're going to set up our state class that's going to allow us to define what an actual state is in our state machine. To get started, we're going to open up the included project, go to open here, and I know I have it on my desktop, so I'm just going to go to Zenva AI, select folder, and I'm going to open up the latest released version with just a Windows build targets fine for now, and go ahead and open that up. Included in the project is a simple little tutorial scene that has a couple of objects in the scene just to give us something to start with. But we're not going to worry about the level design for now. What we want to do first of all is just create a scripts folder so we can keep all of our scripts in one location. So go to create folder. I want to create one called scripts here and open that up. Now in here, like I said, we're going to create the state class first. So I'm going to go to create C# script and I want to call it state. So before we start writing this, I kind of want to explain the process that we're going to have to use for our state machine to actually work. So the basis for our state machine is going to be jumping between methods, right? So we're going to have, let's say we have three methods. One method is an idle method, one method is an attack method, and one method is a chase method. And these methods are going to act as, let's say they're going to be processed every frame. So take update, for example, in Unity. It happens every single frame. Anything that happens in there will happen every single frame, right? So we want our states to also execute every single frame. So we'll keep that in mind as we're writing this. That way, if we say go from A to B, it won't have to go from A to B in one frame. We can do it over time and handle that very easily. Another thing that's going to be important is the ability to transition to and from a state and call what's called an OnEnter and an OnExit method, right? So whenever we jump into that state, I want to trigger something. So let's say we jump into the chase state. I'm chasing the player. What do I want to happen? Well, instead of just chasing, I also want to trigger an animation at the start of that. So the, we'll say zombie, when it starts chasing the player, right when it goes into that state, we're going to fire off the OnEnter method that we're going to set up for chase, and it's going to trigger the animation event. Or maybe just make a noise or something, whatever it might be that you want to happen at the beginning of the state, and then we're going to process the state, so every single frame while in that state will execute whatever is in the chase method, right? So if we do that, we have OnEnter, and then while in the state, we have something to execute, and then we want something to execute whenever we leave the state. So for this case, again, I would want to stop the animation once I leave the chase state. So you trigger it when you enter it, and you trigger it when you leave it. Pretty simple, and that'll be the same setup we have for all of our states. And I'm saying the word state a lot here, and we're about to write the state class. So what is a state going to be? Well, it's going to be the method that we call every single frame. So like I said, we have the chase state, idle state, and attack state, or whatever I said. Chase state, every single frame, we're going to call the chase code, right? The follow the player code, whatever that might be. We're going to use a navmesh with a nav agent and just pathfind to the player, make it kind of cool that way. So that's going to be the thing that happens every single frame that we're checking for every single frame. And then a state also has to have the OnEnter method and the OnExit method I just explained. And it also has to have the ability to execute that. And we'll write all of that in our state class. Now, this may sound a bit more advanced than you would expect from this, but when I'm writing it out, I think it'll all make a lot more sense to you when you see really why we're doing what we're doing. So I'm going to open up state. So first of all, my state class does not have to inherit from mono behavior. And that's because we're not going to be using it as a component on a game object, right? A mono behavior can be used as a component. We're just going to be using it as just straight up class that we're going to create a new instance of using the new keyword, which again, you can't do with the mono behavior. So we don't need that functionality from mono behavior class. I also don't need the update method or the start method for this. We're going to write all of our own stuff for this. So we're going to write, first of all, just a simple constructor. This is going to allow us to initialize state with some values. So just the typical approach to a constructor, you're going to type in public state, or I can type in CTOR, hit tab twice, and it's going to just make the constructor for me. Pretty cool. But obviously I need to pass in some data to the state, right? Like I said, I want to know what method I want to execute every single frame while we're in this state, what method to execute whenever we enter the state, and what method to execute whenever we leave the state. So having all that in mind, we have to then figure out How do we assign a method to a field? How do we know what method to call when? It can't be a string or an int, obviously. Well, we could pass in a string name for the method, but that gets a little more messy. So what I want to do is I want to assign the method to something called a delegate, right? So a delegate is something like a function pointer. It will point to a method to execute whenever you invoke that delegate. And we could write out the delegate ourselves, or we can use something, it's kind of like a shorthand delegate that allows us to just briefly define what we want. And by that I mean, we're going to just type in public system.action. It is a type that is in the system namespace. And I'm just going to say it's going to be the active action. Now, what is an action? So we're talking about delegates, and this being a shorthand type of delegate. All it does is it handles the creation of the delegate itself, and all we have to do is worry about assigning the actual method to this field, right? So we don't have to worry about how many parameters it can take, the type that it is, because it can take whatever type we pass in, and that's all we need for this. So just to give you an example, if I were to create a method now down here as a void, and I will call it shoot, just like that. And then in my constructor here, if I say active action is equal to shoot. So what you just saw there is I just assigned a method to a field, and the field has a type of action. Now to clean this up a bit, I'm going to take system, and I'm actually going to include the namespace with a using statement, so using system. So we don't have to have that before every single action that we use. And then action active is equal to shoot. So now if I were to want to invoke shoot method using this reference that we just created with the action field here, I would say active action dot invoke. And that would, in this case, be the exact same thing as calling shoot, right? So it's going to invoke whatever method is assigned to active action. But the reason we're doing this is because we're going to be able to use this for any state on any object that has a state machine on it, which we're going to create later. So we don't know what it's going to be beforehand, right? If we're on the enemy that has an idle and a chase, that's fine. But again, if we're on the door that has an open and closed state, we don't know what that is before we write it, so we can't actually add the functionality to the state like this. We have to make it more generic so it can take any type of state and any method. So that's why we have this action, so we can actually assign an action whenever we need to, whenever we're writing the AI for our enemy. Cool, so the next thing I need is actually another action here, public action, and it's going to be the OnEnter action, so the action that is called whenever we enter this state. And again, public action OnExit action, whenever we leave the state. And you also could just say OnEnter action with a comma there, get rid of this one. And that would be the same thing if you prefer to keep it all in one line like that. I don't usually, but we can do that for that example. And then all we have to do for this is set up the constructor to take these parameters and assign it to our fields for state. The first one being the active, the second one being OnEnter, and the third one being OnExit. So whenever we create a state, we're going to pass these values in to the constructor. So let's say on our enemy, we are making a new state. We'll pass in idle, OnEnter idle, and OnExit idle. Then all I have to do is say active action is equal to active, OnEnter action is equal to OnEnter, and OnExit action is equal to OnExit. Pretty basic stuff there. Let's get rid of the shoot method. We don't need that anymore. So now we have everything we need to actually set up our states. But the next thing I want to do is add the ability for each state to be individually executed. So we'll call the active action. But I want to do it with a method that's going to be publicly available outside of the state. So for in the enemy, in the update method, we can say whatever state dot active action dot invoke, and then we'll do that every single frame. But instead of doing that, what I want to do is I want to write a method that'll do that for me. So I'm going to say public void, and I want to call it execute. And it's going to be if active action is not equal to null. So we're going to check, first of all, make sure that we have an active action assigned. If we don't want to execute anything. We don't want to throw any errors or anything like that. So first of all, make sure it's not null. Make sure something exists first. And then what we'll do is say active action dot invoke. And that's just going to call whatever action that we passed to this. Again, every single frame if we call this from the update method, which we will be doing. And then I'm going to write one of these for the OnEnter and the OnExit as well. So OnEnter. And we can just copy this and just fill it out here. OnEnter action. We want to execute OnEnter action. And again, for the OnExit. OnExit action, and then invoke OnExit action. And now we'll be using this to actually execute all of the things that our state can do. So in the state machine, whenever a new state is added, we will call that state's OnEnter method. And whenever a state is removed, we will call the removed state's OnExit method. But while it is active, we will call the execute method so we can actually do whatever that state says we can do. And that's all we have to have for our state class. And we'll be using this in the next lesson whenever we create our state machine. So my name is Austin, and I will see you in the next lesson.